Okay, so I just finished looking through a flop check versus bet range and listing out all the combinations on Jack 8-4 with two spades. And we're going to take a look at the way that that range is constructed, the way the hands end up in bet, the hands end up in check, and we're going to go from there. So against a standard opponent here, I'm actually going to end up doing a little bit more checking on the flop than I would do betting. We have about 960 combos here between the two. I believe it's 962. And 380 combos are betting. So you have about 40% flop continuation bet on this board. Now, if you're playing versus opponents that have higher percentage fold to c-bet, you could certainly look to maybe put in some of your weaker queens, weaker kings, weaker ace-high hands into that flop c-bet range because they will directly profit. At which case, you can look to maybe make this a little more even between both ranges, somewhere around 450, 460 combos in each. But regardless, as a more default strategy here in the small blind, the right range are hands that I'm betting, and the left are hands that I am checking. So let's kind of walk through and talk about each. And I guess let's go ahead and start off with talking about all of the bets, and then we'll go from there. So for starters, when I have hands like queens through aces, I am always going to be betting those on the flop. If I feel that my opponent is playing particularly aggressive with their turn probe strategy, or maybe they're just folding simply too much on the flop, I might consider checking some portion of my aces back. But the thing is, those overpairs, they do suffer from different turns and rivers, and additionally, you need to have some hands, some value range, right? And the overpairs to the board are, generally speaking, your core value range when you're looking to start betting the flop and look to barrel. So queens, king, aces, we're almost always going to be betting. Top set, actually, maybe we should do this in relative. Let's do this in absolute hand strength, actually. This is probably a better way to go about it. So let's start off with pocket jacks, even though we've talked about the overpairs. We'll start with pocket jacks. So when I have top set on these boards, where it's the nuts, I think it's important to split between betting and checking. And I actually think checking is the superior play than betting on these boards. Because when you have jack-jack on jack 8-4, there's way less combinations of top pairs they're now willing to call you when you decide to bet. So there's a lot less value in looking to bet those hands. And I do think betting it sometimes is good because, again, when you have strong hands, if they check raise, ends up being a very favorable spot for you. But checking on average ends up being the better play. So for this reason, I usually look to check about 2/3, 3/4 of my very strong top set type hands. There's going to be 3 combos here. So, of course, 2 will be checking and 1 will be betting. I do think if you always wanted to check, that would be fine. I think always betting would be a mistake because I think checking is the stronger play given the card removal that you have. Okay, next up, middle and bottom sets. I'm virtually always putting these hands into the bet range. They are much more likely to get action from the big blind. They're much more likely to get 3 streets because they're more likely to have top pair. So I'm not a big fan of checking either of these hands back on the flop. I think that they're just much better served as continuation bets. Next up, the 2 pairs, and I'm almost always going to bet all of my 2 pair combos. All of these hands suffer from different runouts. Maybe you could look to put in a small portion of checking your top 2, but even then, I think I prefer, in general, just going with a flop bet. So 2 pair, we're generally going to be betting. Maybe look to put some top 2s into the check. Checking with top and bottom or bottom 2, I just think it's a much worse play. I think there's a lot of value you can get with those hands and equity denial and that type of thing. Okay, so moving on now to our single pair hands. We already talked about queens through aces. All very standard value bets, looking to triple on a lot of runouts. Maybe not runouts where certain draws get there, but on brick runouts, on standard runouts, these hands are looking to go 3 streets. And then we move into our Jack X. So the way that I like to think about my top pairs, middle to strong top pairs are always going to bet the flop. And the stronger pairs, the stronger jacks of those are looking to go 3 streets. The middling jacks are looking to bet flop and check turns. And the weakest jacks that you might consider betting on the flop, those are only going to bet part of the time. So hands like Jack 6, Jack 5 here, those hands are going to half bet and half check. And it's important to start splitting those hands up because I think that while betting is probably the more profitable play with those holdings, If you always bet them, you're going to weaken your check range too much by not having top pairs in your check back range. You need to have some top pairs, particularly if you're going to face opponents that are over betting or going for check raising your delay C bet. You got to have some top pairs that you can call them down with, or else your check range is going to suffer too much. So strong top pairs, bet looking to go 3. Middling top pairs, bet looking to probably check turn, maybe bet, bet, check. Weaker top pairs looking to split between check and bet on the flop. And the weakest top pairs we're almost always going to be checking back. In this case, the Jack 3 suiteds, the Jack 2 suiteds. I'm actually going to go, that should also be a bet. Just missed that before. Okay, cool. So Jack 3, Jack 2 going to check. This spot's kind of interesting in that you don't really have Jack 4 through Jack 2 off. We're not opening that pre-flop. So those hands might be hands you would consider checking should you have them. Because you don't have them, it would be reasonable to decide to just take Jack 5 and put that into the check range. So you always make sure you have a good solid number of top pairs in that check back range, or else you're going to have a lot of problems versus check raising on delay C bet. And if they go probe and barrel for very large sizes, not having any top pairs will be a detriment to your range. So the jacks are almost always bets, and the weaker ones become more frequently checks. Now 8x on the flop. I generally lean towards checking almost all of those. However, I do think there is a need to mix in a few of the 8s for several reasons. The first one is that when you bet an 8 and get called, you are ahead of their range with the stronger 8s. And second off, it allows you to have a few more hands that can bet flop check turn. It gives you a few more ways to improve on a turn ace or king. And then it also makes so when the board, when the middle pair pairs and your opponent might start overbetting, you can have some 3 of a kind. So there's a bunch of good things that happen from betting these hands. I do think checking tends to be the superior play. The way that it plays, should you check back, they make great call downs. However, I think that taking your ace, your best second pair, your second best second pair, betting half and checking half is about, I think it's the better play. After that, once you get into your middling 8s to weak 8s, I think you should almost always be checking these hands. They're certainly better as checks. They're the heart and soul of your call down range if you check back. And when you bet and get raised, they get put into very awkward spots. So I think there's a lot of reason to check these hands, and it ends up being the stronger play. Let's move into, actually, let's talk about 10s and 9s. We almost skipped them. 10s and 9s, I like splitting between both options. It's funny because betting 10s and 9s is actually a more attractive play than betting a strong 8. Because when you have a strong 8, you now block one of the 8s that they can have, whereas with 10s and 9s, that is not the case. So when you do bet 10s or 9s, they're less likely to have a draw because you block the straight draws, and they're more likely to have a pair, and that pair is more likely to be a 4 or an 8 than it is to be a jack. So 10s and 9s, I think both make sense. I kind of like checking the 10s and 9s with a spade because they have more playability across turns and rivers, and I kind of like the idea of betting the ones without. However, you can split that up however you want to, as long as you're doing some mix of betting and checking. Now, moving on to talking about the pairs between 8x and 4x, I think these should almost always be checks. If they bet the action they get, you can't really continue versus raise. If you get a call, you're not in a good spot versus an 8 or a jack. You need to improve to either a straight or a set in order to win the hand. So I think that those pairs don't really make that much sense to bet. And bottom pair, I also feel should be generally checked. I like the idea of betting a couple of them, maybe the strongest ones or the weakest ones. The strongest ones because they have the most equity when called, and the weakest ones because they're the most vulnerable across different runouts. So here I just have half of my ace-4s betting. If you wanted to mix in a couple of your weakest 4x's, that could be okay too. But here's the thing. When you have middle and bottom pair, the better play is usually to check. So you should be generally checking those and mixing in a few of those types of hands into your bets so that you can have 3 of a kind on some of those runouts. And you do get a little bit of thin value from some of those hands, but your general goal should not be to take a lot of hands that are thin value and bet the check later, because then what happens is your turn barrel frequency ends up dropping too much. So you want to pick hands that are going to quite often bet turn, quite often bet river, and those hands are not really in that category. Another problem with betting specifically hands like 7s through 5s, when you do get called, because you block all those straight draws, they're more likely to have pairs. Those make much worse bets than hands like 4x, because at least with 4x, you have much more equity when you are behind, and you don't block any of the draws they could be flooding you with on the flop. So That's how I'm basically planning on playing all of the pairs. Threes and twos, you know, if you want to split these up, I have all threes and twos checking. If you want to split them up and just say, okay, we're going to bet the ones without spades because they have the least playability, and you want to bet and you want to check the ones with spades, that's fine. Generally speaking, I check these hands, but it kind of also depends on how your opponent's playing. When players have very high fold to flop c-bet, or they're playing weak versus the flop c-bet in general, then betting some of those under pairs in the flop is good. When you're playing people that are playing aggressive, they're check raising a lot, they're not folding, I start kind of hating betting these hands because first off, when they get check raised, they have to fold. They have bad equity against the call range, and you know, how are they really going to play on turns river? Is he going to bet check back turn call river? Yeah, you might be able to pick off some straight draws, but there's going to be a ton of bad runouts for you, and it's just not a very attractive situation. So in general, I like checking them against stronger opponents and betting them against weaker opponents, which is going to become relevant in the hand we're actually going to discuss after this range analysis. So after the pairs, generally speaking, my stronger high card hands, my stronger flush draws, my stronger straight draws, all of those hands I lean more towards checking. Now, the reason I like checking those hands is because they get way more turns rivers that they can play across as opposed to their weaker counterparts. So on a board with two spades and a heart, I'm generally betting with hands where my high card's a heart. When I have, you know, ace 2, king 3, queen 5, those types of hands I'm looking to bet so that when the flush gets in, I can represent the flush with a blocker to it. You know, I can represent the flush. Say I bet queen 5 on the flop, turn comes another spade. I can look to bet queen 5, 3 streets representing that flush. So generally speaking, you want to bet some of your worst high card hands on the flop, planning on repping those hands on the flush runouts. It's clear. It's a very important thing to note. These hands make bad barrels on bricks because you block the hands that you want them to fold. So generally speaking, I like betting a few of those worst overcard hands on the flop, and maybe turn on some boards. This is not a turn. This is not a board we want to consider betting those because we have so many draws to choose from that we're already almost going to town too hard on the draws by including some of them in the flop range. So I'm not the biggest fan of using too many of those hands on turns, unless it's a board where it's very hard to find hands that have equity to bet with. But let's not get carried away too much. We already talked a bit about that in the flop betting range. The middling to strong high card hands, I like checking them because the pairs that they improve to are going to be good, so you can value bet them or call down. And when you bet those hands and face a check raise in the flop, they perform pretty badly because if you had just decided to check it back, you could almost always call the turn and play some rivers, or at least call a lot of turns and play some rivers. And by betting the flop and getting check raised off your equity, it's kind of a disaster. So, you know, we can kind of think of it like our best hands we bet for value. Our middling hands, we're going to check, play turns and rivers. Our semi-bluffs and some of our backdoor equity hands, we're going to bet on the flop. And then our weakest hands, like, you know, queen 5, no spade, no heart, those kinds of hands, no spade, no heart being on the high card. Those kinds of hands we're looking to check back and put into our delay c-bet range. Okay, so now that we've kind of broken down the way that the bet range works, the way the check range works, let's go ahead and take a look at the check range and talk about the way we would play across this run out. And I'm going to kind of ignore the action in this hand because it doesn't play out the way that I want to talk about. But let's just take this for example. So check, check. Our opponent bets 628 to win 888. So he's betting 628 plus 888, 1516. He's betting 1628 divided by 1516. Okay, so we can fold about 41% of our hands here, and on this turn too. We've got 56 combos times 568 combos. That's how many we can fold. 235 can fold, so 568 minus 235. Oh shit. 538 minus 235. So we have to continue here with about 300 combos. So let's map out and pick our folds. And this is an important concept that I think a lot of players butcher and heads up. You don't pick your calls in these spots. You have to pick your folds, because if you only pick your calls, you're going to end up picking way too few of hands to continue across turns and rivers. So we've got 568 combos. let's pick our folds. So let's start off with these weak high card hands that are non-paired. These are going to clearly be folds. These hands without a high spade are going to obviously be folds. So the high spade will fold with the low spade. Let's see here. What else do we have? All of these suited 3 hands are going to be folds. Yeah, because they're not checking back if they have the flush draw. Oh shit. Okay, so these hands are all folds. We're going to pick out the folds, and then we're going to go from there. Shit. These are all still... Okay. All right, so we're picking all these high card folds. We're going to fold these ones now. If they have a spade, they're betting the flop, so we don't have those in our range. And these are all going to be folds as well. These cannot have high cards in them because if they have a high card of that suit, we are going to be betting the flop. Okay, and now we can start to pick out some more high card hands that do not have spades in them. So let's start off with these guys. So we're going to, if either card's a spade here, we're going to float. Let's say that all of these guys are going to float with spades. And then for these ones, we're gonna call with a spade as well and fold otherwise. Okay, so we're down at 340. So we can actually pick out a few more folds. Twos should also be in this range, obviously. All right, let's see, what else can we fold? We can fold 5, 6, and 7s without a spade are definite folds. Because even though they're stronger in absolute hand strength, you're blocking all of these draws that you want them to have. So that actually makes them kind of bad calls. Actually, particularly bad calls. We're going to fold 3s without a spade. Okay. So now we have a stronger range of hands. These straight draws are going to fold without a spade. Now we can actually start folding some 2s. So we've gone through all the high card hands. We're folding all of our best high card hands. Now we can start folding out our worst 2s. So our worst 2s are going to be the 2s that have a card with it that block the draws. So 10-2, 9-2. 7-2, 6-2, 5-2. Those are all the worst hands. And we still actually have a few more folds that we can make here. If I had to pick, we're going to pick some of our weakest spade hands. So let's go ahead and pick out... We'll pick out a couple more 2s. Pick out a couple of these really weak king high ones. Okay. And we're there. All right, so a bit tedious of a process, but we did it, and now we have our turn call range. So now we have a 40% turn fold. We have about the right amount of hands, and we can play rivers. And getting used to this process is really important. You have to walk through, look at all of the hands we check back, look at the calls, and go from there. It's important to do a few examples yourself where you pull up your whole pre-flop open range, put in your bets, put in your checks, work out your checks, work out what your folds can be, and then work out what your folds can be if they barrel. So now, let me just put this range over here really quick because I want to talk about two different things that could happen. Actually, let's leave that guy. Okay. Let's start off with talking about if they decide to barrel the river, which doesn't happen in this hand, but let's just say that our opponent decides to bet about 1,500 here on the river. So it would be 1,500 plus 2,144.7. All right, so we can fold again about 41% of our range, okay, which is a relatively standard size. So then we would take that, multiply it by the amount of combos, which is 301. We can fold 124 combos. 301 minus 124. Oh, shit. Sorry, 124 minus 303. All right, so we can have 179 combos here that need to call down. So on the river 2, actually, hold on. We're not going to pick our calls. We're going to pick our folds. So let's start off with the folds. And actually, before we even do that, let me just open with this. Go full cam for a second here. When they bet here, we're going to have a raise range. But we're not going to start off with picking out our raises, our raise bluffs, all that stuff. We're going to start off with picking out our calls. Okay? We're going to pick our value raises, then our calls, then our bluff raises, then our folds. Okay? The folds are last. Now, the reason we pick the calls first is because we don't want to raise with hands that can profitably call. We want to raise with hands that can't profitably call, or are worse profitably calls, and make those the bluffs. So, going back over here. Let's start off actually with, let's do this. Let's make this the raise range. So, what hands can we have here that are going to raise for value? Well, if our opponent bets the turn and bets the river, I think it's kind of safe to say that we do not want to be raising here without at least 3 of a kind. So I think that these 2s make good raises. Let's make it this turn A2 of spades. And there are the 2 of hearts. Okay, so let's go through this. So these 2s make good raises if we can have many of them, which we cannot. After that, all of the flushes that we can have, which are the King 9, King 10, King Queen, Ace King, Ace Queen, and then most of these nut flushes. That should have been folded on the turn. Spades. Okay. What else? This is a hand we can definitely have. That's a hand we can definitely have. What else? What else are they raising here for value? It's kind of it. Oh yeah, 2-2. Okay, so we start out with our value combos. We have 21 combos for value. Now, let's move over to our calls. So in this spot, we need to have about, let me pull the calculator again. So we've got to continue with approximately 180 combos, I believe it was. 170 combos, 179 combos. So we got 300 combos, 303. We're going to have 21 raises. So we have 282 combos left. And now we need to have 179 continue. Sorry, let me redo this. 179 minus 21. So we have to have 158 additional combos, either call or raise as a bluff. So we're going to pick out our folds, and we're going to get this number down to 158. And we're going to start off by taking this. No, we need to get this number down to 179. Oh, I know what we're going to do. So we need to get to 179. Sorry, guys. This is all a live video, so bear with me really quick. So we got to get our total combos that we're going to play to 179. So let's pick out our folds on the left. So we have our continue range. And then we'll make our raise range. Okay, so let's start off with the easy folds. The 4s here are going to be easy folds. The bricked spade high card hands are also going to be fairly easy folds. Okay, we're down at 219. And we don't actually get a lot more folds after that. The way that I would do it is I would start to go in a more linear fashion here. For starters, I'm going to fold these pairs that have the bad removal. And now we're down to 210. And we got to pick a few more folds. So we're going to start picking off our 4s. And we're going to pick the 4s that have kickers that block straight draws. Okay, and we're already there. So maybe it's better to call... We definitely don't want to call those. Maybe it's better to call ace 4. Okay. So something like this looks good. Just pick one of these, okay. Or no, sorry, not one of these. Spade, okay. Something along the lines of this looks good. I mean, I know it's a few combos off, but again, we're doing it live, so let's like not get too bogged down by that. All right, so now we have our continue range. All these hands are either going to call or raise, and we have 21 combos of value. So we have to decide what size are we going to go. Now, because it's a pretty static spot, it is a paired board, our opponent can have good hands. I see no reason to not go more than around a standard size raise here on the river, which would be to about pot. So when you raise to pot, you get to bluff about 1 combo for every 2 for value without considering removal. But then considering the fact that when your opponent has good hands, you need to be bluffing less, we're going to say that we need about 7 value bets for every 3 bluffs, just to be a little bit more, conservative here on the amount of bluffs we're going to use. So we have 21 combos of bluffs, which means for every 7, which there's 3 of here, we could have 3 bluffs, which means we get to have 9 combos of bluffs. So we have to pick out what are the best 9 combinations of bluffs here. And generally speaking, we want it to accomplish 2 things. We want them to be bluffs that, or actually really 3 things. We want it to be a bluff that can't quite profitably call, has good removal to the flush, and has good removal to boats. So that means that this hand definitely has to have a 4, because it blocks 4-4, as well as 4-2 suited, possibly Jack 4 or 8-4. And we definitely want to have a spade as well. So what I would try to use here is the best 4s that I could have in the spot that also have a high spade. And it's kind of debatable if you want to use ace-4, maybe you have to call ace-4, so instead we would use a hand like 10-4, which we're not opening. So in this case, it might be a hand like, what's the next best 4? 5-4? 7-4? 7-4? So now we have our range picked out here, kind of all done on the fly. Hopefully we learned some lessons here. We have a call down range that prevents non-equity bluffs on the left. We've got a raise range between 3 of a kind of flushes mixed in with some bluffs. And then all of this is balanced. We have folded the right amount of combos. We've called the right amount of combos down. We've developed a balanced river range. And this approach is going to be very solid. Okay, so I want to quickly say this. Doing this stuff on the fly, you have to put a lot of practice in to get good at it and to be able to sometimes ballpark things. You know, a lot of times when you're in a hand, it's better to make the decision that you feel is better against an opponent and then go back and review it later. But the concepts of not having a turn raise range to kind of keep everything together, making sure to not allow non-equity bluffs, and then making sure that you start with the value range on the river. You start with value, and then you put in all those calls, which is going to be a lot of your hands. In fact, in most spots, if they bet, you're going to call with most of your hands, because if you don't, you allow those bluffs. And then you pick the bluffs out of the folds. So those bluff raises, they came out of hands that we couldn't quite raise. The king 4s, the queen 4s, the 7-4s that have a spade, those were the hands we decided to bluff raise with, because the ace-4 has to call, and all the 8 or better hands, 8x or better, I mean, of course, those have to call as well. So that process and being efficient at that process is really important heads of the limit. That's where you get a lot of your edge. And that's also one of the reasons why players tend to take a long time on decisions, because even if you have a hand that clearly goes into one of these different places, thinking about the way all of your hands would play here matters a lot. Oh, and by the way, we would actually have some jack hands that check back at least 2 combos of that as well to bluff raise river. So maybe we could have another bluff or 2 in there in terms of combos. But thinking about everything in that way, that process will make you very hard to play against when they probe and barrel. And I know that there's a lot of different flop c-bet strategies going on right now. I advocate for a more standard, like, a little over half pot to 2/3 pot c-bet, looking to barrel around the same frequency. But when you do check your hands back, you have to be able to play out of that. You have to be able to play out of those combos, know how weak or strong you are. If you are c-betting a lot of hands and you have more air, maybe you can make some bigger folds and you check back and you face barrels. If you're checking kind of weak, you're going to have to be a stronger player with a weak range. You have to figure out a way to build a strategy that can counter your opponent. And one thing that happens a lot is when you're playing someone and when you're playing someone and they're playing really tough against c-bet, oftentimes you're going to have to make some pretty light call downs when you check back because your range ends up being weaker because not enough hands have the equity to bet the flop. And being aware of that and being willing to call down a bit lighter is important. Like maybe versus those opponents, you want to bet more top pairs, bet more 8x. In that case, a lot of your 4x hands that check back the flop on Jack 8-4 are going to have to call down on this run out. Those are important things to think about. So I think that's going to call it for this video on breaking down all those combos. Maybe we'll take a look more specifically next at working in river raises.